Hi there. I'm going to do a little commentary on a video that I saw that was a response to my response to Nathan Orman's video, and it's by James Fodor. And I decided to do this video, and I usually don't do response videos to response videos, but I decided to do this because there's some relevant information that I feel I can share with respect to the Gospels and the authenticity of the New Testament and the entire accounts of Jesus's resurrection. And I feel that some of the information that I can provide, I've recently learned some of it because I've been in the middle of reading Lydia McGrew's really excellent book on the Gospel of John, and the fact that the Gospel of John was supported by all kinds of ancient sources. In fact, we find that the Gospel of John is the early church fathers, many early church fathers gave it credibility. And so I'm going to give you some information on the Gospel of John's credibility, but I'm also going to give you information on the other Gospels' credibility. And we're also going to discuss a little bit about Paul and a little bit about some more things today. And so I don't have too much time. Actually, I've got over an hour, so I've got some time. But I also am going to provide you with some information and responses to this James Fodor video, because he is trying to sprinkle a little bit of doubt into people's mind with respect to the Gospels. And I feel that it's not some doubt that you need to have. Now, let me first share. Just realized I forgot to turn on my other computer so I can monitor the chat as we go. So hi, Nightmare. Funny name, Nightmare. Okay, so let's go and take a look at this sort of thing. So let's go to James Fodor's video without further ado. Okay, so let me just make sure I get the volume full on. Here we go.
So that's what I wanted to say about that. And that's sort of in response to people who might want to put more detail, might want to move it beyond a minimal facts argument and say, well, the Gospels have all these details. And I ask, well, how do we trust those details? And I'm not convinced. All right, so let's finish out by now playing some of this. No, wrong button again. Share screen, share audio. And we're going to look at this one. Now, this honestly is probably not worth responding to just by itself. The main reason I decided to add it is because, well, I'm already doing a stream and I just found out about this video. Might as well respond to it. Okay, so this is a response to obviously our 10-hour stream on the resurrection, responding to Andrew Loke's book.
Let's actually give that some thought for a minute. These gentlemen, there were a few of them, decided to spend 10 hours on a stream on the resurrection. Now, you have to think about exactly who Jesus was. Jesus was a carpenter who was around from an ancient, obscure place in Galilee in the ancient Near East 2,000 years ago. What do you think would drive these people today to devote 10 hours, and in fact, full work days of their lives to be discussing someone like Jesus? Well, Gamaliel explains that. The Pharisee Gamaliel, who is well respected in the Jewish community, back in Acts 5, we've got a record of Gamaliel telling the other Pharisees, leave these men alone. Okay, they had arrested they'd arrested Peter and another disciple. And he said, leave these men alone. If their cause is not from God, it will die out. Just as the cause of Judas, well, anyway, the cause of a couple of other people who had claimed to be the Messiah, their causes died out when they died. But he said, if this cause is from God, you will not be able to stop it. Now, we know that by 313, between 5 and 6 million people were following Jesus, despite heavily being persecuted sporadically through the centuries. It was a very peaceful movement in the beginning. They didn't fight with the sword. They didn't conquer land. They didn't conquer people, and they didn't force conversions. The Christian religion of the first couple of centuries, the first 280 years, was a very peaceful movement. Constantine legalized it, and by the mid-4th century, we did see about 50 million people starting to follow Jesus. And we did see the start of some people doing some things that were more corrupt. And of course, we can't claim an entirely free history of no bad interactions or no bad people. Of course, we've got that in our history. But we also have this idea that we're supposed to be more like Jesus. Who was Jesus? What kind of person was he? Well, we know from ancient people what kind of person he was. We know a lot of really good information about him. And we know that a lot of even skeptical and secular sources who were non-Christians gave us a lot of accounts of Jesus. So here we go.
So this is S.J. Thomason responding to us, responding to Loke. So now I'm going to respond to someone responding to us, responding to Loki. So it's like a response to response to a response. But this is how these things go. Hopefully there'll be a response to the response to the response to the response, and it just iterates infinitely. Anyway, let me know if the sound's working. Let me turn this up a bit. All right, I'll start off with the RHBS. So people who've listened to some of my
and we have
got a
Apologia.
It's awesome. Welcome. Well, Apologia can actually articulate his theory. So yeah, my Rspf hypothesis may be familiar to some who've watched some of my videos before. So the hypothesis is named after the key elements: reburial, hallucinations, biases, and socialization. So the basic idea is that it's designed to explain all of the standard minimal facts, which includes an empty tomb. Whether or not you think it was one, I think that at least we could try to explain if there was. So my hypothesis is that the tomb was empty because Jesus' body was removed by Joseph of Arimathea because it was a temporary burial to ensure that the body was taken down over the Sabbath.
Okay, so he's positing something that
remove it.
Okay, so he's positing that Joseph of Arimathea temporarily put Jesus into the tomb. Now, there's some counter arguments to that. Number one, let's note the fact that Joseph of Arimathea, we have no indication of that in any of the references of Joseph of Arimathea, that he was going to temporarily keep Jesus in the tomb. Number two, the women who followed Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb went to the tomb on Sunday fully expecting to be able to bring spices and take care of and anoint his body. And they were surprised when they found there was no body inside of the tomb. And so 2 points refute that. The ancient historians, ancient people reporting back then refute that. But he'll persist, even though there's absolutely no reference that says Joseph was going to leave him in there for a couple of days, and then who knows what he was going to do with the body after that. So I certainly don't see that being the case when he treated Jesus in such a loving way, bringing him over to the tomb.
All right, so first point here. Why is it implausible that, I have no reason to think that S.J. Thomason has read my book or anything more than this video. And I fully...
Now, he's completely right. I have not read his book. I didn't know James Fodor. I actually did not know him at all until I watched Nathan Orman's video. So we go.
Knowledge. My brief account there is not like persuasive. It was just supposed to basically give an idea of where I'm coming from. That's what we were doing at the outset. We weren't trying to convince people to give reasons for thinking what we're saying was true. It's just so you can compare what we think to what Locke thought.
Okay, come now, let us reason together, says the Lord in Isaiah.
I don't even think I necessarily articulate it in the best way there. I probably need to think about ways of being more persuasive about a brief summary of the RHBS model, because it is a bit complicated. I mean, things are complicated, right? You can't, you're going to make them so simple. But anyway, so it's fair enough if you didn't find my brief presentation persuasive, but nevertheless, so I don't want to be unfair in saying, well, you didn't read it, so you can't respond fully, but she is still responding to it, so I'll make a response here. Now, she first said that we have no indication from the ancient sources that Joseph of Arimathea had any intention of doing any such thing. Now, I think people who've been listening probably know what I'm going to say at this point. Yes, of course, we don't have any record of that. There's no reason we would have any record of that. All we have are Gospels written decades after the fact from people who almost certainly weren't.
Okay, this is one of the things that a lot of people like to posit is Gospels written decades after the fact, to make it sound like this was written way, way, way after the fact. Now, consider a couple of points. Would it be possible for someone like me to be able to construct a paper on Dr. Martin Luther King, even though he was around decades before my existence? Could I go back and find people who lived under Dr. Martin Luther King, who understood Dr. Martin Luther King? Would it be possible for me to do that? Well, of course it would. I could do that. It's possible. However, we actually have some pretty good information that the Gospels have relatively early dating. For example, in the Acts of the Apostles, which was written by Luke, Luke wrote that after he wrote the Gospel of Luke. And in that Gospel, in the Acts, we note that the two primary characters, which are Peter and Paul, their martyrdoms were never disclosed. However, we do see the martyrdoms of James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee. And we also see the martyrdom of Stephen, the very first martyr. However, we don't, again, see the martyrdoms of Paul, which we do believe occurred around the year 64 under Nero. We believe he was beheaded, and we have ancient early attestation to that. And we don't see the martyrdom of Peter mentioned, even though we know that Peter was also martyred in that early time. Now, you can go back to Sean McDowell's book on martyrdoms to get some further information on that. So why wouldn't the author of Acts, who's Luke, disclose that information about their martyrdoms if he wrote this after they were martyred? Well, the logical idea is that he wrote this before they were martyred. And we know that Acts was written after Luke. And historians and scholars believe that Luke was written after Matthew and Mark. And so, but here we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke all pretty early. Now, John might have been written a little bit later, but I do have some very good information on John. So here we go.
There, Yeah, sure, relying on some oral tradition, but there's no reason why they would have included any details about Joseph of Arimathea, whom they didn't know. Joseph of Arimathea.
Exactly. They didn't know Joseph of Arimathea. In fact, it's almost embarrassing that a Pharisee would be the one to take Jesus' body off the cross when his family and his disciples did not. Okay, so the Pharisee took his body off the cross and put it into his personal tomb. Interestingly enough, that was predicted in the book of Isaiah, that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb.
Arimathea, I don't think had any interest in being an ongoing part of the Christian community, or even if he did, if he's saying he removed the body, then he's going to be ostracized because he's like, oh, no, guys, I removed the body. And they're just going to ignore him if he did say that. But I suspect he probably wasn't interested in being part of it. I don't think he was. I think he may have been a sympathizer, possibly to the extent that he thought Jesus was getting a bit of a rough deal. But I mean, maybe not. That's just a possibility. But I don't think he wanted to be a supporter. You can be sympathetic without being a supporter of someone, right? There's a distinction there. Pilate is portrayed as being sympathetic towards Jesus, but certainly not a supporter. So why couldn't Joseph of Arimathea have been similar? So I think most likely he didn't want to have anything to do with the ongoing Christian community. And so whatever he did or happened to have said about it wasn't preserved. And even if he did say things about it, the Christian community wouldn't have preserved those. Remember, we only have...
How would he possibly make this assertion? Even if Joseph of Arimathea was sympathetic and to the Christian community would not preserve it. Well, clearly we did preserve it. We have the information in the Gospels about Joseph of Arimathea.
We do not have any first century accounts that are hostile to Christianity.
Wrong. Sorry. I'm just sorry. This is just getting silly. Okay, here's what we have. We know from Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Talmud, Marabar Sapian, Suetonius, Thales, and Phlegon and Lucian that Jesus existed. These are all ancient hostile support. We know from Celsus that he claims he was born of a virgin. We know from Celsus also that he lived in Egypt at one point. Remember, out of Egypt I called my son. His brother was James, according to Josephus. He practiced sorcery, according to the Talmud. Celsus says he had miraculous powers, and Josephus says he was a wonder worker. He was wise, according to Josephus, a wise king and teacher, according to Marabar Serapion. Phlegon says he had knowledge of the future. Lucian said his followers considered themselves brothers. He claimed to be God, according to Celsus. He was worshipped as a god by followers, according to Lucian, Pliny the Younger, and it was worshipped on a fixed day of the week, according to Pliny the Younger. According to Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Celsus, Talmud, and Marabar Serapion, he was executed and crucified. The Talmud says he died on the eve of the Passover. Earthquakes accompanied his death, according to Phlegon and Thales. And actually, I have further documentations that earthquakes occurred in the year 33, according to some geological records in current scholarship that I've cited before. He was buried in a tomb as per Jewish customs and law to keep the ground pure. And that's from Deuteronomy 21. Jews even buried malefactors, according to Josephus and Tacitus. Disciples said he appeared to them alive 3 days after the crucifixion, according to Josephus. Christians were martyred, said Suetonius and Tacitus, and Christians who refused to recant were martyred, according to Pliny the Younger in his letter to Trajan. His followers made an oath not to commit wicked deeds. Okay, so I have just cited a lot of extra biblical sources, many in the first century. Okay, so this claim by Mr. James Fodor is without any support.
Zero, zip, nada, zilt, zitch, niet, nothing. So saying that we should have that, we would expect to have that, is ridiculous. And again, it's an argument from silence. If we would expect to have this particular detail about this figure.
So I'm arguing against the argument from silence. I'm arguing that we actually do have support for an empty tomb account from Joseph of Arimathea in the Gospels. Now, James can discount that, but he doesn't have support for this mass grave that he's asserting. Okay, the only support that James has for a mass grave comes from an assertion that that's traditionally how Romans might have buried their victims. And that is true. However, Jesus was in the middle of Jerusalem, in a Jewish place, and the customs were the Romans would allow the Jews to take care of their own. Joseph of Arimathea was a Pharisee, a Jew. He wanted to do the proper thing and bury Jesus, and he buried him in his own tomb, according to the accounts. So here we go.
Why shouldn't we expect to hear more about the corpses walking around Jerusalem? I think that you should always use that as a counterexample to anyone arguing from silence. Because
actually, James is arguing for a mass grave. You're going to see that in just a moment.
If you could not have reports of corpses walking around Jerusalem for everyone to see, you can certainly not have accounts of Joseph of Arimathea not wanting to remove the body. I don't even see why any accounts would have even been written about that. I don't think Joseph wanted to be involved. So this is a very, very weak argument from silence here. Excitement and the uproar of the so that was one thing she said. The other thing that she said is that Joseph of Arimathea lovingly buried Jesus, and so it's inconsistent that he'd want to later remove the body. Well, what I hypothesize is that, I think I even said this in the summary, maybe I didn't, I should have explained myself more clearly. The reason I think that Joseph removed the body is the most likely thing that I think happened is that Joseph always intended to move the body. It wasn't even really buried, it was more just stored in his tomb, because A, the Sabbath was coming and they needed somewhere to quickly put the body that was nearby, and B, it was important to put it somewhere that was private, out of the way, secluded, relatively unknown. I mean, maybe some people could follow to the tomb, right? But I don't mean that it was like a public location that everyone already knew about, like the mass graves would have been for the resurrection. So when I say secluded, I don't mean like secret necessarily, but just private and out of the way, so as to avoid further trouble and further uproar, which was a big concern of the Romans. And the Jewish leaders had to ask for permission for the Romans to execute Jesus, and so they wanted to stay on the good side. They didn't want to make a big issue of it, so they knew the Romans didn't want to have a fuss. That would have looked bad looked bad for the Jewish authorities. So it was in their interest as well to ensure that that didn't happen. So that's, I think, the reason why Jesus' body was placed in the tomb. Again, assuming it was. Again, I'm taking that for the sake of argument. So Joseph of Arimathea always intended to move it after the Sabbath as soon as he could, which was on the Friday evening. That's why when the women went to the tomb, it was empty because it had been moved.
So he is saying, this is the claim that James Fodor is coming up with, that Joseph of Arimathea took the body off the tomb, okay, and then a few hours later, on Friday evening, he took the body out of the tomb and moved it to some undisclosed location. This is an assertion with no ancient support. It's ludicrous. Why would he put him in the tomb only to remove him a few hours later?
On the Friday evening. On the Saturday evening.
Oh, okay, better. Okay, on the Saturday evening. This is even better. So he is claiming that Joseph of Arimathea, on the Sabbath, a devout Jew is going to do some sort of work on the Sabbath. As you know, God commanded people not to do any work on the Sabbath. Why would he posit that a very devout Pharisee is going to do work by removing Jesus's body on the Sabbath? Makes no sense. Okay, James has not thought through his conclusions.
Now, maybe you'd say, well, Joseph would have told the women. How do you even know that they knew who Joseph was? I mean, again, assuming for this sake of the argument, Joseph was a real person, I think it's plausible he was, but maybe he wasn't. But supposing Joseph was a real person and the burial narrative happened as described, why would Joseph have told these random women followers of Jesus, whom he probably never met in his life, that he was going to move the body? Even if he wanted to, how would he have known how to find them? It says they scattered afterwards, right? So, the women didn't scatter, though. They kept on looking. But
okay, right. So the women actually followed Joseph to the tomb. They knew where the tomb was. It's reported in the Gospels.
Even so, like, why would he be interested in doing that? Even if he did tell them, and they got word, oh, the body's been moved, they're going to want to go and check anyway, right? And they found it empty, and maybe they saw the risen Jesus as a hallucination, so they didn't believe that his body had been moved. There's so many possibilities here of what could have happened. Okay,
they saw the risen body as a hallucination. Now, let's note that even James, I guess he's pronounced Fodor. Okay, I thought it was Fodor, but Fodor. Even James Fodor, this idea that these women had a shared hallucination. Now, this is something that he refutes himself later on. They cannot have a hallucination because you don't share hallucinations, just as you don't share dreams. They're internal. Okay, you can't share a dream. Like, I don't have a dream today, and then tomorrow I get in my dream and my husband joins me in the dream and we both dream the same dream. That just doesn't happen.
But the problem is, I can't tell a narrative. I can't say exactly what happened because I don't know. I'm trying to be honest here and saying, here's a possibility, but there's lots as well, and I'm not sure. And that's just never as persuasive. So that's why I don't think that we're always going to have an uphill battle here in offering these, because they're just not as narratively persuasive as the gospel accounts. But I don't think these objections are very good because, yeah, as I said, there's no reason we would hear anything about what Joseph of Arimathea was planning. Very weak argument from silence, and there's no reason we would have told the women what he was planning to do that occurred when Jesus was tried. And then on Sunday, after the Sunday and on Sabbath, the body was removed, and the women followers came on Sunday morning and found the tomb empty. Upon that happening, one or more of them experienced some sort of bereavement-based direct hallucination of Jesus, which they then told to Peter and all the other disciples. That triggered a series of appearances as a result of a combination of bereavement, the fact that the tomb had been reported empty, and the initial reports, plus general sort of excitement and trying to make sense of what happened. So that's the hallucinations part. But those experiences were not necessarily what's.
Okay, it is Fodor. So I was like, sorry if I mispronounced your name anywhere, James. Please take my apologies on that.
In the Gospels. In fact, I think that they probably. This is a good point. Although the thing is, what Christians usually do is, sorry, for those who were just listening, Bob is saying the Gospel accounts aren't exactly narratively cohesive either. True, although individually they are narratively persuasive. And what Christians normally do is just basically, like Loke did in his book, they just make their own harmonization and then basically believe that.
It's quite easy to harmonize the gospel accounts. I haven't read Dr. Loke's book, but I'm going to have to take a look at that. But he's going to mention the birth narratives here. You can actually completely harmonize the birth narratives. You have to realize that there's a reason why Herod decided to kill all the children under 2, is because the period of time in which the birth narratives were written was over a couple of years. Okay, so Jesus wasn't always a newborn infant in the birth narratives. We have a time period here. We know that a lot of stuff occurred. You can just easily put those 2 gospel narratives together, and they fit like a glove, by the way. I've written on this and I've done videos on this, but I won't get into it right now. But they fit together like a glove. We know that he was born. They did the proper things that they were supposed to do on the 8th day by taking care of him in the temple and the circumcision and that sort of thing. And then at some point he went off to Egypt, and then he returned. So
that, do you know that I didn't even know when I was a Christian that the birth narratives of the Nativity were that, like, half of it is in John and half. No, sorry, I'm going to get this wrong. Half of it is in one gospel and half of it is in the other. Is it Matthew and Luke that they're in? I think. I didn't even know that until later on, and I read up on this. Like, wait, what? How did I never realize this? This is actually really interesting. That maybe this other Christians will resonate with this. I'm not saying I was the most well read on this sort of stuff when I was a Christian, but we read that nativity story like every Christmas for years when I was a child. And I remember reading it. We read some from one gospel and some from the other. I think it's Matthew and Luke, right? So it's not like I didn't know that they were from different gospels. It's somehow they never put together in my head that, like, hey, half of the account is not in the other, like there's actually an inconsistency here. Because to a Christian, it's all the Bible, right? It doesn't matter which gospel it's in. Like your standard Christian I'm talking about, not to the apologists, they understand that. I've even had discussions with Christians where they don't seem to understand that originally it was a bunch of separate documents that were then compiled together into what they now call the Bible. I think
he's sort of strawmanning Christians here. He's assuming that a lot of Christians are relatively ignorant of their gospels. A lot of Christians might be, some Christians might be, but I don't think that that's a clear case. I think a lot of people are starting to get much closer to their gospels. So we see right here from Luke, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Now, there were 2 censuses. Otherwise, Luke wouldn't note that that was the first census. One census was taken rally around the year 2 BC, 2 or 3 BC, and the other census was taken around 6 AD. And everyone went to their own town to register. One of the assertions some people have come up with is based on a person who has posited that Herod the Great passed away in 4 BC. However, that's based on a very weak hypothesis. Now, I've written on this, and I've read a really good scholarly article by someone called Steinman, written in 2009. And Steinman looked into the information, and he realized that the amount of days that passed, and this is all reported by Josephus, but the amount of days that passed between the time Herod died and the Passover in 4 BC were too few for all of the accounts of what Herod did in those days. He realized that the few days that passed between those 2 events, the very weak eclipse in 4 BC and the time when Herod died, again, that amount of time was too short. Okay, so he actually looked at 1 BC and realized that in 1 BC, there was much more time that had elapsed, and you would have more time for this sort of event. And in 1 BC, actually, we also have some information that there was much more time. The eclipse occurred in January, and the Passover occurred in April. So there were many more things, many more days for Herod to complete the events that Josephus recounted. My point is that means that we push Jesus's birth up a little bit to somewhere between 2 or 3 BC. Okay, and so the events that are reported in Luke are pretty consistent. So here we go. and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house in the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room for him. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news, and will cause great joy for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly host appeared to the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. When they had seen him, they agreed the word concerning what had been told them about his child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Jesus, the name an angel had given him before he was conceived. When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it had been written in the law of the Lord. Okay, remember, all of it was on the 8th day. Every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves and 2 pigeons. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple counts. And the parents brought to the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required. Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised." And he went on. Okay, so people marveled at that. A lot of different things occurred. And then we get to the report of what happened in the book of Matthew. And so Matthew continues the story. Okay, so she continues the story about the Magi visiting. So we see the part where it says, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to the son, and he gave him the name Jesus. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born, the King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and had come up to worship him." Okay, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem's with him. When he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Okay, so anyway, King Herod decides to order that all of the young men under 2 are killed. So we know that there's an extended time period. They went to Egypt for a brief time. They came back. So we know a lot of this kind of stuff occurred. So let's go.
The Bible as one book, especially the New Testament. So to your average Christian, they don't even sort of, maybe there's a dim reconnaissance of this, but they don't really understand it. They don't appreciate the fact that these are from different documents written by different people at different times. And so the narrative cohesion is there for them. They just sort of read the parts in a row that they make sense in their sort of harmonized version. And of course, the scholars aren't bothered by that because they just harmonize it away, or they have different ways of dealing with it. But I'm talking to your average Christian. I think the fact that it's a different gospels just doesn't seem to bother them. But it should. I mean, it should bother them. It's just that's what I mean by narrative cohesion. For them, it's the whole thing. Well, we weren't like those. They were appearances of or experiences of an unknown sort. Then over the succeeding days and weeks, as the apostles
I'm having
sort of
trouble here stopping this. Okay, so sorry, my thing is just sort of lighting up here a little bit. What I wanted to comment about that is, here's what we do know from the Gospels. All 4 Gospels report that the women were the first to discover the empty tomb. And I think I made that pretty clear. They traveled in groups, but they separated at times, and they initially went back and told the disciples that they saw the risen Christ, and the disciples did not believe them. Mary Magdalene was actually the first one to witness the risen Christ, and other women also witnessed the risen Christ. And so he was appearing to people. Now, that's not mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 as that early creed, because again, you'll recall from Josephus that women's testimony was not to be considered valuable. And so the reports are mainly of men, specifically of men mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. And so that's what we know from our witnesses. We don't have ancient evidence supporting an alternative story that Mary was merely crafting a vision of a person, a bereavement vision of Jesus. Because again, let's remember what happened after this and what they did. A bereavement vision doesn't drive somebody to preach that the person resurrected from the dead and was with them and ate with them and drank with them and did all the things that Peter and others mentioned that Jesus did with them.
So even on what I've said here, which I'll acknowledge is brief, it's hard to see how Thomason's really listening to what I'm saying here.
What's hilarious is I pointed out in this particular video a little bit later that I get a lot of dislikes on my video. And look, I've got 4 likes and 4 dislikes already right out the door. Now, James comments that everyone gets dislikes, and I'm looking at his. He's got 32 likes and 0 dislikes. Amusing. It's just people like crazy.
Because it's an RHBS model. At no point do I say the hallucinations, especially an individual hallucination to Mary, however, are sufficient to lead to someone to preach the resurrection. I don't say that. And obviously I'm not saying that because it's an RHBS model and I'm going through the steps here, okay? It's hallucinations plus the empty tomb plus the subsequent collective appearances plus the memory biases plus the socialization effects and all of that stuff together that generates the belief in the resurrection.
He's putting together a lot of assertions, isn't he?
And leads them to believe it and go on and preach it. I said that here in brief. And it's strange to object that a single hallucination to Mary wouldn't be sufficient. Oh, no, I don't think it was sufficient. I also don't object that the women were the first to the tomb. I don't understand why apologists bring this up so much because it's just granted. Sure, they found the empty tomb. I don't see the problem with that. It doesn't prove anything, in my opinion. Well, they think it suggests the reliability of the empty tomb. I don't really know how to assess that, but since I'm granting that anyway, it doesn't matter for my purposes here. So that's not an objection. I'm not sure if she thought it was, but she mentioned it. So I'll just clarify. It's not an objection to my account because I grant that the women discovered the empty tomb. So yeah, I don't argue that a single hallucination by Mary or any of the other women or anyone, in fact, was sufficient to generate all of what happened subsequently. There's many other steps to it. And that's the next parts of the model. Also, it was strange when Thomason said that Mary's not crafting a narrative. Well, I didn't say she crafted a narrative. I said that she experienced a bereavement hallucination, or Mary.
Okay, so he's claiming that Mary experienced a bereavement hallucination. Now, let's note, this is Mary Magdalene he's speaking of. We know from the 4 gospel accounts that the women were the first to discover the empty tomb, and Mary Magdalene was the very first person to see Jesus. And then he appeared to the other women, and then he appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, and at some point he also appeared on the road to Emmaus. He appeared to 2 other disciples. One was named Clopas and another one, and he opened their eyes to the Gospels, and he opened their eyes to the Old Testament and explained to them exactly how what had been prophesied in the Old Testament was coming to life. So if you guys haven't had a chance yet, go back to look at Isaiah 53 and read the account of the suffering servant and how he was supposed to be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Take a look at that account because that speaks very clearly to Jesus. And that particular account brings people like me, opened my eyes a long time ago. It's also opened a lot of Jewish people's eyes, and a lot of them are now Messianic Jews. Psalm 22, written 1,000 years. Isaiah, of course, was written 700 years before Jesus appeared. Psalm 22 was written 1,000 years before. And Psalm 22 talks about how his hands and his feet were going to be pierced. And yes, the word is pierced. Okay, you can go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls to see that the word is pierced. You can look at Dr. Michael Brown, who is a very smart Messianic Jew who reads the ancient Hebrew. He understands Hebrew. He understands the Koine Greek. And Dr. Michael Brown pointed out that in Psalm 22, which is written in, of course, Hebrew, that the word that was used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls and also in some transcriptions, was pierced for our transgression. I'm sorry, pierced his hands and feet. Zechariah 12:10 also says his hands and feet would be pierced. Now consider that the crucifixion method of torture, of death, the crucifixion had not even been invented when the Psalms and when Zechariah and when Isaiah were written. Okay, that hadn't been invented. That was invented around the 4th century BC by the Persians. And it was perfected by the Romans and made truly evil. So let's go.
Or one of the women, right? That's not a made up crafted narrative. That's an experience that she really had, which was meaningful to her. So I don't understand where the crafted narrative comes in. The narrative was developed later through processes that I discuss, but I don't think anyone was being devious about it. They thought they were getting to the truth by, reading the scriptures and praying together and discussing it and so forth. It just, I think, now we understand that those are the mechanisms that led to a development of an account that was not actually what really happened, that led to delusions, effectively, false beliefs that they held to very confidently.
I want to say Ghostlight is bringing up a very strong point. Ghostlight says the resurrection can explain all of the data with one hypothesis. James needs at least 5 hypotheses to explain all of the data. That is a great point. Thank you, Ghostlight. Also, thank you, Digital Gnosis. I see you guys in the chat. Ronan Kanushi, Michael, welcome. You guys, it's very great to see you today. Hope you're having a great day. Here we go.
But I didn't say that Mary made it up or anything like that. That's not part of my account. And I think that even in the brief summary I gave, that should have been quite clear.
Now I can't get it back on. Hold on. My thing's frozen up here. Let's go back. Okay, so let me just fix this again.
Yes, I love this point. Thanks, Gabriel. It's a shame the modern average Christian isn't one of the 500 diehard skeptics who witnessed Jesus. Yes, because Loke said this, and I think Craig and others say this, that the 500 and also the initial apostles were really skeptical. They wouldn't have been convinced by anything less than really solid evidence, and they would have checked with each other and fact-checked. And likewise, the people that Paul was preaching to in Corinth and everyone else would have checked and fact-checked and gone all that way to check with the witnesses. Whereas it seems that early skepticism really died out, and most Christians actually just accept what they're taught in Sunday school and what they read in the Bible without further thought or doing a skerrick of research. I was one of these people. And although I did think about my faith, I always did, probably more than most, but I didn't think about it in sort of a historical, critical context. It just never occurred to me to think of it that way, to be honest.
A lot of us do that when we were children. When I was a young child, I also didn't really think about my faith. I didn't think about my faith very much until my 20s, and I started kind of wandering away from Christianity, thinking it was a mere default. And it took me a couple of decades before coming back to God and before God opening my eyes in a way that I could truly understand. And he realized my heart wasn't ready for it when I was in my 20s and 30s, but my heart was ready for it in my early 40s. And so I came back to God after a number of spiritual experiences and chance encounters with like a pastor on a plane and that sort of thing. And so I'm just pointing out the fact that sometimes you do wander away. And a lot of times you end up coming back. In fact, you can look at the atheist retention rate that's cited by the Pew polls of about 30%. Many people end up coming out of atheism as they get older and wiser.
Until I learned more about the Book of Mormon, but that's a separate question. So I never deconverted on the basis of critical assessment of New Testament, because for me it was the Book of Mormon and then Mormonism, and then I lost my faith in Christianity as part of that. But the point is that was the norm, and I think it's the norm for most Christians. So it's a bit odd to think that everyone in the first century was super skeptical. But yes, I think that is a very profound point, actually.
Okay, so he thinks everyone in the first century was what? Let's see.
That should be raised more often. First century Christians were nothing like modern Christians. They were super skeptical and evidence-based. If only we had that these days.
Okay, so I will grant a couple of things. One thing I'm going to grant is that, yes, we have people today who are super skeptical. And yes, we have people today who are very unskeptical. Okay, we've got a mix. And they could be in the Christian population and they could be in the atheist population. We've got a combo. There are a lot of atheists who jump on the atheist bandwagon without further examining exactly why they believe the resurrection did not happen. As Ghostlight has pointed out, the resurrection is one simple hypothesis that explains the entire workings of the New Testament and that which I already read to you from the extra biblical secular sources in ancient times. Okay, so it well explains all of this information. His building on model hypothesis is making a lot of assertions, like Joseph of Arimathea decided he was going to remove the body right after he buried it on the Sabbath. Okay, he's doing work on the Sabbath. That's James's idea. He also posits that these people all had hallucinations, and they all just happen to be the same hallucination. Okay, he's positing that they believed their hallucinations. And he says that there are multiple who had hallucinations. Now, I have to say, I use the word conspiracy theory because I feel like if they were doing this and they relied on a mere hallucination, they would be duping people into a life where they're going to be martyred. Okay, so that would not be something that was on the good side. That would not be a positive thing if they were merely experiencing hallucinations. However, they said they spent a period of 40 days with Jesus. He appeared to them over 40 days in multiple ways, in multiple modes, indoors, outdoors. He appeared to them as individuals, like as to Peter, as to James, his brother. And he also appeared to them in groups, as to the 500, as to the 12. He made multiple appearances to the 12, inside and outside, as I said. for the nth time. Okay, let's get back here. Share the screen. All right, so my thing's freezing up there, so I'm just...
By the way, I'm not saying Thomason is like that person who never thinks or critically analyzes things. I'm just responding to a point that's being made. And with respect to my own experience and many other.
Okay, Nathan's correcting me. It wasn't the same hallucination. However, it would be the similar hallucination. He's saying that they all had these appearances of Jesus in hallucinations. They weren't shared, but each of them had individual hallucinations that happened to be appearances of Jesus. That's essentially saying it's the same hallucination.
People that most Christians don't engage with any of this stuff and don't require very good evidence for their beliefs. So it's a bit odd to say that the earliest Christians or earliest people would have as well.
Returning it back to the video. All right, here we go.
Together and read through the scriptures and prayed and fasted and whatever else they did. They had further experiences in groups of the risen Jesus appearing to them and interacting with them in some ways. And as they discussed this and the experiences got sort of refined in terms of what they believed happened, and there was memory contamination, memory biases. That's the biases part of the model.
Okay, memory contamination, memory biases. Again, this is another very similar conspiracy theory in that they develop these all uniformly. And we're talking about multiples of people developed memory biases. Okay, conspiracy 101.
And finally, as time went on, so I mean, obviously I'm biased here, right? But it's hard for me to understand how anyone can listen to what I just said, even granted they don't know anything else about what I've said, listen to what I just said there and get from that I'm advocating a conspiracy theory. If anyone in chat thinks that it is in any way reasonable to infer from what I said that I'm advocating a conspiracy theory.
I want to say something that I see that Enigma Conjecture is saying. The Enigma theorem, counterpart to Pine Creek theorem. The majority of atheists deconvert for reasons other than logic, science, or skepticism. I think that's true. I think that the majority of atheists deconvert for emotional reasons. Okay, or for reasons where they and this is actually sad. Maybe they had a terrible event occur in their life. Maybe they feel like they called out to God and they prayed and they didn't feel like they got an answer or the answer that they wanted. And so we see that kind of thing occurring, and I feel very badly for those kind of people. And I want to see just try to serve as a light to open the doors to people's eyes.
Then I'll back down from that, because I know that I'm biased here, but I feel like that is just so ridiculous to infer from what I said that I'm talking about a conspiracy here. Memory contamination and memory biases and other effects like that are not.
So he's saying that all of these people who wrote the Gospels and who wrote the New Testament, essentially, so Peter, Paul, James, the 12, all of these people have memory contamination. Okay, got it.
A conspiracy. That's just completely different phenomenon.
At some point, there has to be an overarching theme or message they had to put together. Okay, so there has to be some sort of getting together, whether or not it's in a conspiracy and with malintent, or whether it's and actually, if it's not a conspiracy, then it would be in good intent. Either way, they all did come to these beliefs, and these can be explained well by the resurrection.
Phenomenon. I don't even understand how you can confuse that from what I said. This is when people talk to each other and they confuse each other's memories for their own. That's memory contamination. Memory biases, when you remember things that didn't happen, your memories change over time through reconstructive recall. That's completely different to a conspiracy theory. You're not making it up deliberately to plot anything. That is nowhere part of my account. Even the gospel authors who I think did make things up, I think that they didn't think of themselves as lying or being engaged in conspiracy. They thought that they were extrapolating or embellishing in good faith, and that was accepted and so forth. But I'm
okay. Where does it say they were extrapolating and embellishing? In fact, in the Gospels, we have a lot of very embarrassing testimonies, like Peter denying Jesus 3 times, Jesus's family trying to stop him, people thinking that Jesus was a drinker. All this kind of stuff is embarrassing. And so putting it down in the Gospels only indicates that the Gospel authors wanted to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If they wanted to embellish, they certainly wouldn't have women be the first to discover the empty tomb, because women's accounts weren't considered credible according to the ancients and Josephus. I'm
not even talking about that here. I'm just talking about the initial disciples and the other people who experienced the appearances. So my question to Thomason, if you ever watch this, how do you get, am I so unclear in my communication that when I say memory contamination and biases, that it's reasonable to, that a reasonable person infers that I'm talking about conspiracy there? I legitimately don't understand how one can get that out of what I said. Maybe I need to communicate more clearly. I'm open to that, but that seems to be so far off what I said. And people began to tell these stories. There was a process of socialization where if anyone sort of was dubious of something or wasn't quite sure, they were reinforced by the community they were in, or shunned outside of it, because they would have been lacking in faith, or they would have been illustrated to have a sort of spiritual deficit if they didn't believe or didn't remember correctly. And so as a result of that, you can get within a few months, I think, a sort of a creedal life story emerging of a series of, and at least possibly, that's what was passed on, and Paul eventually heard, and we see the product of that in 1 Corinthians, and then later that is the basis of the stories.
Okay, let's talk about Paul for a second. So Paul eventually heard, and that's the basis of 1 Corinthians. It's much more beyond that. Okay, you actually, the one problem the atheists have is they cannot explain the situation with Paul. So what is the situation with Paul? Paul was on the road to Damascus. Okay, he had just obtained the legal rights to be able to convict Jesus followers. They called them from the way. So he was going to go ahead and round them up and throw them in prison, or even watch them be martyred. He was standing at the feet of St. Stephen when St. Stephen was martyred. He was all for that. He's a very ardent Jew. He had been trained under Gamaliel, who was considered very elevated among the Jews. Gamaliel was known as a very wise teacher and someone to whom many thought was a valuable person around. Paul had a lot of status under Gamaliel. He was very knowledgeable of the Old Testament. So what happened with Paul? Well, he's on the way to Damascus, marching down there, muttering evil words about Christians, when suddenly he hears this: "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He says, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now, Paul suddenly was blinded. He ended up going into Damascus and fasting for a couple of days. Then the Lord sent a helper to open up Paul's eyes, and his eyes, it was like scales falling from his eyes. He spent the next decades of his life preaching for Christianity, going against everything that he had stood for before. He finally realized exactly what was prophesied in the Old Testament. You see, people didn't just put together the Old Testament stories at that time. Their eyes had deliberately been closed to the New Testament, to the prophecies. And why is that? Well, because God didn't want Satan and his demonic other figures, didn't want these people having any sort of knowledge of what might happen. Satan would never have stepped into Judas had he known what was planned. Okay? Their eyes had to be opened. In Luke 24, we see the whole story of their eyes being opened. We also see the story of the eyes being opened to Isaiah 53 in later events. Okay, so here we go.
Along with then further legendary developments and extrapolations and later traditions that were incorporated into the Gospels. So
one of the things about the Gospels that you guys might want to make mention of, and you might want to note, and the reason why the Gospels and the other books of the New Testament were accepted into the canon is because the people who wrote those books were considered either eyewitnesses or friends to eyewitnesses, people who knew the eyewitnesses. For example, we believe that Matthew and John are apostles, among Jesus's apostles. We also believe that Luke was a doctor, but he was also recognized as an historian. Luke was traveling with Paul, and so Luke was a witness with Paul, but Luke also, and that's mentioned starting in Acts 16. We know that the book of Mark was written by somebody who was a good friend of Peter. And so that's made mention of throughout Paul's writings. He talks a lot about Mark, and Mark at one point leaving and then coming back. But Mark was written by a person who was an associate of Peter. And so we have that kind of evidence. And we got a lot of internal evidence that these sources are the ones that we say they are. We have no ancient sources pointing to any other authors aside from the four mentioned. But one of the things that we see in these Gospels are some pretty embarrassing things. Like, for example, when Jesus' family...
Hang on, so she's sort of moving a little bit here.
So I
want to respond to what she said first before talking about embarrassing details. So I don't know why we would have any ancient ascriptions to different authorship, because the traditional authorship was accepted as traditional, right? It's sort of unclear to me why we would see any other authorship.
It makes sense that we would see other authorship. Now, in the 1st and 2nd century, we only have the church fathers pointing to the Gospels. And let me give you a couple of quotes from Lydia McGrew's book. So Lydia gathered information from a lot of the early church followers. And I'm going to be talking to Lydia about her internal and external evidence on Monday. So please join us for that conversation. But here's what we know from patristic support. So here's Irenaeus's comment on Ptolemy around the year 170. Further, they teach that John, the disciple of the Lord, indicated the first Oglode, expressing themselves in these words: John, the disciple of the Lord, wishing to set forth the origin of all things, so as to explain how the Father produced the whole, lays down a certain principle, that namely, which was first begotten by God, which being he has termed both the only begotten Son and God, in whom the Father, after a seminal manner, brought forth all things. By him the Word was produced, and in him the whole substance of the aeons, to which the Word himself afterwards imparted from. The Muratonian canon around 170 says the fourth of the Gospels is of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and bishops who were encouraging him, he said, "Fast with me today for 3 days, and whatever will be revealed to each of us, let us tell one another." The same night it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that all should certify what John wrote in his own name. Why then is it remarkable that John so constantly brings forth single points, even to his epistles, saying of himself, what we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears, and our hands have handled, these we write to you. Thus he professes himself not only an eyewitness and hearer, but also a writer of all miracles of our Lord in order. Here's something attributed to Papias. The Gospel of John was published and given to the churches by John when he was still in the body. As a man of Hierapolis, Papias by name, John's dear disciple, has related in his 5 exegetical books. He indeed wrote down the Gospel correctly at John's dictation, but the heretic Marcion was thrust out by John after being repudiated by him for its contrary sentiments. Okay, Theophilus of Antioch, around 180. Hence the holy writings teach us, and all the spirit-bearing, inspired men, one of whom, John, says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Okay, Irenaeus. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, the one who leaned back on the Lord's breast, himself published a gospel while resided in Ephesus. John, the disciple of the Lord, preaches his faith and seeks by the proclamation of the gospel to remove that error which by Cerinthus had been disassembled among men, and a long time previously by those termed Nicolaitans, who are offset of that knowledge, falsely so called, that he might confound them and persuade them that there is but one God, made by all things by his word. And then we have, that was around 175 to 185. Tertullian says, the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels also, which we possess equally through their means and according to their usage. I mean the gospels of John and Matthew. Why that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. For even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribe to Paul. And it goes on and on and on. We've got Origen, Eusebius, I could read other quotes. And so we have evidence, ancient evidence in support of the gospels from the ancient authors. And of course, Lydia McGrew's books mainly on John, so that's why you saw most on John. We also have ancient support towards the other ones as well.
So Thomason is here saying, we believe, and then she mentions traditional authorship of all 4 gospels. I don't know who we is supposed to be. That's certainly not critical scholarship. That's not even people like Lacona. Even Locke didn't argue this, or Habermas, or...
So I'm arguing in support of the early church fathers and what they attribute as the authors of the Gospels. The early church fathers do not attribute the Gospels to anyone else. So making those attributions, which we do see today, I'll admit that we do see some people today like Lacona and others who are very skeptical of the Gospels. They seem very skeptical of a lot of stuff. I think that's quite fashionable in modern scholarly circles. And I think it's very sad because it goes against what the early church fathers told us.
Craig or any of the others who argue for the minimal facts style approaches, they're not arguing for traditional authorship. I mean, they may elsewhere, but they're certainly not doing a minimal facts approach. And I don't know if they all do agree.
So the minimal facts doesn't talk about traditional authorship of the Gospels. That's just absurd, because the minimal facts by Gary Habermas was designed not to include the Bible at all. Gary Habermas was told to write a dissertation that proves Jesus' existence based on facts outside of the Bible. So the minimal facts is based on secular information from the ancient past, not on biblical. So it has, this is a non-connection here between the Bible that James has looped and the minimal facts arguments.
Agree with minimal, why do I keep saying minimal? With traditional authorship. So I don't know who we is. I mean, that's rather unclear to me. I don't even think a Christian has to believe in minimal authorship. It's just minimal authorship from now on. For some reason, that word keeps getting in there. Doesn't have to believe in traditional authorship. So that's a bit unclear. But I mean, I guess you're saying that she believes that, which is fine. I don't believe that. I think I'm on board with the majority of scholars there who don't believe in traditional, I got it right, traditional authorship of the Gospels. I think that the model, RSPS model, does get harder if you think that, say, Matthew and John were written by actual eyewitnesses, because it becomes harder to understand how there was so much extrapolation. But I think we just need a few extra hypotheses to account for that, probably.
We have one hypothesis, Jesus resurrected. He's got a few hypotheses here and there, and I like what Ghostlight said. Let's just multiply the probabilities of James's hypotheses to get the incredibly unrealistic probability that his hypotheses all fit together and tell the true story.
More memory distortion perhaps needs to happen, and maybe we have to...
More memory distortion needs to happen. Joseph of Arimathea had to have taken the body out of the tomb when the body was in the tomb on Saturday, the Sabbath. He's just really getting a little out of hand here. And so
analyze how they would understand history and what was acceptable for them to say as a little bit even more liberal or accepting than perhaps we might otherwise have thought. Because it's one thing if you're a later author who's drawing on oral tradition, and another thing from if you were actually there personally if you're writing this, right? You'd think that would be a bit more constrained. I mean, I don't think that was the case. I'm just thinking, suppose that we did grant traditional authorship. I think that you could still use the RHBS. It would need to be adapted a little bit to account for that. We need to make some more postulates. But I think that that's not really a problem because traditional authorship is so implausible anyway.
Not really.
And there's so many other things that you wouldn't expect to see in the Gospels if they were written by traditional authors, like the differences. Like why is Matthew and John's, why are they so different if they're written by people who are at literally the same event?
Okay, so if we both attend an event, like if I go to an event and you go to an event, are we going to craft together the exact same type of message? No, that doesn't even make any sense. So John witnessed something, Matthew witnessed something. They each witnessed Jesus over a period of a few years. And they recollected their accounts of what they considered important within those events. John was known to cite a lot of the miracles of Jesus. And Matthew was primarily writing to a Jewish audience. Matthew made sure he made a lot of references to the Old Testament. And he made references to fulfilled prophecies. Aside from those I mentioned, in Malachi 3:1, it was a prophecy that during the time of the Second Temple, that the Messiah was going to appear in the Second Temple. The Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70. So the Messiah had to have appeared prior to the destruction of the Roman temple. The Jewish temple in 70 by the Romans.
Standing next to each other and they write things so differently. That it's one thing if they're different authors compiling later tradition, but if they were literally both standing there, why are they so different? So I think that, yes, the RHBS model doesn't fit traditional authorship as well, but I think it could be adapted to fit that. But the traditional, but there are lots of other things that don't work very well with traditional authorship. It's implausible and it doesn't fit with what we actually see in the text. So I don't grant traditional authorship, but even if I did, I don't really think it would be that much of an issue here. Also, not really sure how it's an objection to anything that I've said, unless you think that traditional authorship does undermine what I've said. But then I guess I'd like that to be made clear because I don't think it necessarily does. Yeah, maybe there's a few extra hypotheses we need to bring in. It doesn't fit quite as well with the later development of what it says in the Gospel.
Maybe there's a few extra hypotheses we got to bring in. Let's remember Occam's razor. A lot of times the simple answer is the correct answer.
But I still think it works as an explanation. So I'd like to hear a bit more about why traditional authorship like totally undermines what I'm saying here. Anyway, let's hear what she has to say about the embarrassing stuff.
They tried to stop his ministry. They thought he'd gone nuts. When Jesus said, hey, you consider me a drunk, he said something like that, or I drink, or something like that. And so he pointed out stuff that people would consider embarrassing. Jesus says to Peter, on this rock I will build my church. And that particular rock decides to deny Jesus 3 times. That's embarrassing. And so we've got a lot of embarrassing stuff. But then if you go to the first book of Acts, you're going to see that Jesus' family had come around. What made him come around? He was just brutally executed and crucified on a cross. And there they were with the other apostles in the first book of Acts, talking with them and believing in Jesus. James, his half-brother, went on to preach in the temple at Jerusalem for years until he was martyred. And Josephus reported his martyrdom. Okay, so we also know that occurred. We also know from the book of Acts, 2 people, James, the brother of son of Zebedee and brother of John, and we know that Stephen were also martyred. So it was no easy deal to be a Christian at that point. And so let's just recall this. These people aren't getting together, crafting some story so that they can propagate something that's going to bring them death. That doesn't make any sense.
Sorry, I thought you'd finished there. Why does it feel like it's gotten small? There we go. Okay, so it's a bit hard to follow the thread of what she's saying here. So there are embarrassing things in the Gospels. I don't really trust the criterion of embarrassment because it's very subjective about what is embarrassing. I think there's a theological purpose served by the denying 3 times. I mean, you've got the number 3 there, right, to start with, but also I'm not qualified to really speculate on that. I think it seems clear though that there is a theological purpose there that the gospel writer, whichever gospel that is, I don't know, included there. So I think we can account for that using other means. But I mean, what does that have to do with what I'm arguing here? I'm not claiming. I think that Thomason thinks I'm talking about what I think happens is a conspiracy theory that the disciples got together and made it all up. But that's not what I'm claiming. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that that's not what I'm claiming. So the fact that there may be some embarrassing details, would have to ask the gospel authors or interrogate the gospels as to why their authors might have included those. And I just don't see what bearing that has on what I'm saying. I'm not trying to account for those particular details anyway. I mean, maybe those things happen. Maybe Peter did deny Jesus for all I know. I don't really see how that even refutes the hypothesis, because he could deny once and then he experiences something, then he comes to believe, right? So then
he experiences something, then he comes to believe. So just remember, who was there witnessing Jesus at his crucifixion? Embarrassingly enough, just the women and the beloved apostle John. They were the only people present during Jesus's crucifixion. Peter, after denying Jesus 3 times, had gone into hiding. Then it tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, which is a very early church creed written within 5 years, according to very skeptical people like Bart Ehrman and Gert Ludemann. The 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that Jesus appeared to Peter. Okay, he appeared to Peter, and then Peter suddenly came out and started worshiping him.
I don't think he did, but it's just, again, I don't see how that would be something that would refute the model. Something about on this rock I'll build my church. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, that fits with the first will be last and last will be first, right? So I don't even see that that's how an embarrassment. That's consistent with a theological motif that goes throughout the text there. But again, I'm not an expert on that stuff. I don't pretend to be, so that's not my area to try to explain these particular motifs or aspects of it. But I just don't see how that refutes what I'm saying here. What else? Yeah, his family later converted. I've talked about that already. Yeah, they converted. I mean, assuming that they were skeptics or unbelievers originally, which is not a minimal fact, so I don't grant that, but maybe they were, as far as I know, they could have been, and they converted later. I mean, yeah, that doesn't contradict anything that I've said, so I don't see the issue here. They weren't making up the narrative. I don't say that they were, so that's not. I'm talking about socialization effects. Socialization effects is not the same as a conspiracy. Marginalization of doubt, like for example, if you doubt, well then you think that you're sinful, or you got to introspect, and then you talk to others and you say, oh yeah, actually I do remember seeing Jesus in, or something like that. That's sort of how this works. Memory contagion plus socialization. That's what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about a giant conspiracy. That's the basis of my explanation. Obviously we can get into more details when we go through and look at what Bloke has to say. So
he's positing memory contagion, socialization. Okay, so again, what's looping together all of these stories? What's putting it all together?
Who's going next?
Yeah, either do you want to talk briefly, Paul, and just introduce your kind of engagement on this and your theory of what's going on with the resurrection accounts and the data we see in brief?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for.
Okay, I don't think she has anything else to say about my account. So I think the big problem is that she seems to think that I was advocating a conspiracy theory, plus empty tomb, I guess. So reburial plus conspiracy theory, which is not at all what I'm arguing. And I honestly don't see how anyone could get that out of what I said. I acknowledge I may not have been as clear as I could have been, but I just don't think I was that unclear. So I'd be interested to hear more substantive thoughts about what I actually did say and maybe what I've articulated here, if Thomason or others are interested in commenting. While I'm here, I might just have a listen to what she says about Apologia. She talks about Camille a lot more. I'm going to leave that just because it's longer than I want to go through, but I feel like there's some relevant things she says about Apologia's comments as well. Skip forward a little bit.
We would prefer that all of our stuff be written. So I'm here tonight, as to that stuff. But here's 3 new ones that I can that at this point, and we're now entering a phase where he and I are going into
Realize that group
hallucinations, group appearances.
Paul is smart in here. He does realize that group hallucinations are not possible because, like dreams, they aren't shared. You can't share a dream. I can't call you up and say, I'm going to dream that I'm over in Spain right now. Why don't you come on with me? It's not possible. So group hallucinations in the same way aren't shared. It's just not something that's medically possible as the way that people have defined what hallucinations are. But another thing I want to mention about Paul is a Canadian. I've had him on my channel before. I've actually debated him on the minimal facts of the resurrection, that sort of thing. And Paul is willing to grant that some of the apostles were indeed martyred. He actually got onto another debate with Sean McDowell. And Sean McDowell's written a pretty good book.
I didn't know that Paul had debated Thomason before. I must have missed that when I first watched this video. That's interesting. Maybe I should check that out at some point. With regard to the group hallucinations, that's one of the reasons I don't talk about that, because I agree that the way hallucination is typically defined, it's an individual, not a collective or objective phenomenon. And she wasn't directly responding to me here, so I won't say that she misinterpreted me there. But because I have to clarify this point all the time, it's not a group hallucination. It's a group religious experience, which consists of many elements, among which includes individual hallucinations, but they're not all hallucinations.
Okay, so he's just playing with words here. This is word games. In other words, what he's already posited before is that Mary Magdalene had a hallucination. He's positing that others had a hallucination. They all just happened to be that Jesus appeared to them. And he is not actually just acknowledging the fact that Jesus physically appeared to them and ate with them and did a number of other things with them over a period of 40 days, as accounted in numerous different texts and also extra biblically.
hallucinating the same thing.
I mean, extra biblically, I should say that a lot of the New Testament is accounted for by secular sources. I'm not saying that the 40-day period is accounted for by the secular sources, but the apostles reported and Paul reported a lot of the things that I'm giving to you. We also know something really interesting is the story of James, the brother of Jesus. James tried to stop Jesus. He tried to stop his ministry. They thought Jesus had gone crazy. And suddenly, according to 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus appeared to James. He was among those to whom Jesus appeared. He ended up preaching in Jerusalem, and he ended up being martyred for his faith. And that's reported outside of the Bible by a secular Jewish source, a Jewish historian named Josephus.
The analogy to the dream, I think what I've said before fits this well. You can't share the same dream with the person, but if you say, hey, I dreamed this, and then you go to sleep the next night and you both have similar dreams, you wake up the next morning, you talk about it, and you...
How gullible does he think these people were back then? You have to think about what they went through. They sacrificed their lives for Christianity. And they said they saw the risen Jesus. And he admits fully that they believed they saw the risen Jesus. He thinks they all saw it in these individual hallucinations that they all collectively shared. He thinks they saw it in one person saying, hey, I saw Jesus. And then the next person going to bed at night and also waking up the next morning saying, oh, I saw Jesus too. I mean, really? They spent decades following him. You remember from Paul's account some of the ways that they were treated. Paul was beaten, he was whipped, he was stoned, he was thrown into jail numerous times. He ended up being beheaded under Nero. Why? Why would he do that? Why would he give up his very belief system in only Judaism to come to Jesus? Because he said he saw the risen Jesus.
You could come to believe, if you have a sort of sufficient worldview to allow this, that you sort of shared a dream, even though you didn't actually share a dream. You just both dreamed the same, similar thing separately and then talked about it. I think that's pretty much what happened, analogous at least to what happened with the disciples.
That I haven't read yet, but it sounded like it was Goodness Fate, where he really looked at some of the evidence.
Some examples of that as well. And that's what I actually think plausibly happened if indeed Joseph of Arimathea was the one who buried it, as I talk about, because of the unique circumstances surrounding Jesus. But you see, you can only have an exception if there's a rule to which it's an exception. And that's precisely Pelagius' point, is that the rule was that they're buried in a mass grave. There were some exceptions.
Okay, I got to clarify this on the mass grave idea. So Paul is claiming that that Jesus was buried in a mass grave. Now, he wasn't claiming that he was thrown as a body into an open grave. He's saying he was buried in a mass grave. However, we have no ancient support for that. Now, James protests that I say we need to have ancient support, but we do. Give me a break. The first person to make those assertions about a mass grave came about thousands of years later. I shouldn't say thousands. I'll say centuries later, because I believe around the 1800s, people started positing this stuff. And we have early ancient sources that said he was buried in Josephus of Arimathea's grave. Why do we have any reason to doubt that? Merely because an atheist apologist wants to pretend that that didn't occur? Now, Paul is making the almost ludicrous assertion that Peter had a hallucination and was able to convince all of these other people to believe in Jesus and to follow Jesus. Think about that. What kind of a mindset does he think these people had back then? They're going to be risking their lives over decades to be jailed, beaten, all kinds of bad things were going to happen to them merely for Peter's hallucination? Seriously? Do you really think people are that gullible? It's ridiculous. Now, Peter did have, he encountered the risen Jesus. Jesus also appeared to 500 people. The news spreads. The other thing that is not mentioned by James at all in this video is the fact that they were performing miracles. The apostles were given the ability to cure and heal people. And they did do that. And we see that through the book of Acts. And so we also see Paul. Paul was given the ability to cure and heal people. And those kind of miracles where you're able to give somebody back eyesight, make somebody walk who couldn't walk before, all of those kind of things, the news of that spreads. That is the reason why people started worshiping Christianity. They understood the truth of it.
And so maybe Jesus was buried in a private tomb, but more likely, Paul Logi's argument is that it was buried in a mass grave. It
isn't more likely. The argument here that I think that James is failing to really understand is, yes, we will grant the fact that in ancient times, some Romans did crucify people, and sometimes they were buried in mass graves. We also know from history that Jewish people had a practice of taking the bodies down off the pole, as indicated in Deuteronomy. We also know from ancient history that sources tell us that Jesus was buried in a private tomb, not in a mass grave. So to say that just because the Romans in the past sometimes buried people in mass graves, but there were exceptions, and that Jesus was not one of those exceptions, is really a faulty thinking.
That's what usually happened. Now, as to the points about the fact that Jews are really careful to take a body down before the Sabbath and bury them, I mean, I cite that in my book. Yes, that was part of the Mosaic law. Part of the Mosaic law. But that doesn't distinguish between the two hypotheses. One hypothesis, he was buried in a private tomb. Second, he was buried in a mass grave. They're both a burial, right? There's a difference between leaving them up on the cross or just sort of throwing the body on the streets. I mean, that would have been unhygienic anyway. I don't think the Romans would have liked that. Maybe, I suspect that's probably what was being referred to in that other rebel case, because if you really want to disrespect someone's body, you don't bury it. You just leave it out and have people, throw things at it or whatever. See it decompose. That's what the Romans did with the...
But that doesn't speak to what the Jews believed. The Jews believed that the ground would not be pure. And of course, this is during the Passover time, one of the most sacred times in Jewish history is during the Passover, one of their most sacred holidays. And so if you're claiming that they're going to allow someone just to be thrown into an open grave, well, that's a bad claim. And that's actually not something that I think James is claiming. James is claiming that he was thrown into a mass grave, despite our evidence from the ancient times that he was buried in a private tomb.
What was it? I think it was the Spartacus uprising that crucified all of these.
Okay, so here's James's assertions, and I'm going to sum this up right now. James's assertions are: 1, Joseph of Arimathea, if he buried Jesus, if he had Jesus buried, then he put him into either a mass grave or his private tomb. Or Jesus was buried in a mass grave. Ancient support tells us Jesus was put into Joseph of Arimathea's private tomb. The women knew this. The women had trailed after Joseph of Arimathea. We also know his assertion number 2, that Joseph of Arimathea, if he put him into his private tomb, pulled him out of his private tomb on the Sabbath day, on the holy day of the Jews when they're not supposed to do any work. Pulling somebody out and moving them to another location would seriously be a corruption of Jewish practices. So that itself is ridiculous. And even so, why would Joseph of Arimathea take it upon himself to bury someone in his private tomb and then the next day step in there, pull his body out and put it somewhere? It doesn't make any sense. The women showed up, as we know, on the third day, on Sunday morning. The women showed up and found the tomb to be empty. Why? Because Jesus had risen, and that was recounted. Now he's asserting that suddenly all of these people started having these individual hallucinations. They collectively put them together, and this story arose. He acknowledges they believed that they saw something, but he doesn't acknowledge exactly what they said they believed and what they said they saw. They said they saw the risen Jesus physically who ate with them.
Slaves on the road from somewhere other to Rome.
So I hope you guys enjoyed that. This is the end of my thing. I've actually got something I've got to do in a half hour for my work. So I hope you enjoyed that. You guys please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much.